Hi friends, if you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help me reach even more people with thinking faith, please consider supporting the show. Silver supporters get early access to episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters also get signed books and a monthly catch-up with me. The links to support are with the show notes or visit justinbrierley.com. Enjoy today's episode. I just became convinced after hosting lots of debates between Christians and atheists over the years that actually something had shifted in about the last 3 or 4 years. And I just wondered whether Matthew Arnold's Sea of Faith might be ready to come back in again.
Most of us long for unconditional love, and we long to be seen, and we long to be known, and we long for a deep intimacy, and we long for our lives to mean something, and we long to be part of a story bigger than ourselves. And that's hard to find on your own.
It was almost comical the way that she sort of talks about her incredible story of depression and suicidality and manages to crawl out of it by praying. And then Richard Dawkins has to go, yes, but do you believe in the virgin birth? Like, you know, that's the important thing.
Hello and welcome back to the surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast with me, Justin Brierley. Another bonus episode for you today before we return to our documentary format next week. I wanted to sneak this one in because it was a lot of fun and generated quite a lot of buzz too. It's the audio of a recent live audience event I took part in at the UnHerd Club in London, asking the question, Christian revival, fantasy or reality? Now, UnHerd was an appropriate organisation to be hosting this conversation. They were the ones that broke that story last year of former New Atheist Ayaan Ali's embrace of Christian faith in that viral article she wrote for their website. And she followed it up with a moving interview at the UnHerd Club, the same venue where this conversation you're about to hear took place. But just before we jump in, a reminder that you can get early access to shows like this when you become a silver supporter at justinbrierley.com. Gold level supporters also received signed copies of both my books and a chance for a monthly catch-up if you'd like it. So you can support via Patreon or US tax deductible giving. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, do consider helping us to continue it through the rest of the year. And your support also helps me to reach new audiences through events such as the one we're about to hear. The links to support are with today's show. So I was delighted to be invited to the UnHerd Club, essentially to defend the thesis in my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, that we may be witnessing the turning of the tide of belief in the West. I was equally delighted to be sharing the conversation with two friends who have featured a number of times already in this podcast, atheist thinker Alex O'Connor and Christian thinker Elizabeth Oldfield. And the event was introduced by the UnHerd host, Freddie Sayers. Well, just before we get into the rest of today's show, someone we've heard from quite a bit on the podcast is author and speaker Glenn Scrivener. Hello, Glenn.
Hey, Justin. Always great to be here.
Well, for a while now, you've been happily pointing people to your online course 321. Where did that come from?
It's a passion of mine to help people get to grips with Christian faith and to do it in a way that's attractive and imaginative and deep and that assumes no prior knowledge. So 321 is my way of showing life according to Jesus. We want it to be like a mere Christianity for a digital age.
Okay, so that sounds like it's maybe more for those who are not Christians?
Well, yeah, many people have done it who are not Christians, and they've found faith for the first time. We're thrilled about that. But like with Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, Christians love that book too. And the first audience we have in mind for 321 is actually a Christian who wants to be refreshed in their faith and to have something to pass on to their Christian curious friends and family.
Okay, so Christian or not, this basically gets people to the heart of the faith.
Right, and nearly 10,000 people have joined the online platform. It's free. You watch these video-led sessions and you think through the stunning animations, you engage with the chat community, you get a ton of extra content thrown in, and now you have on your phone a Mere Christianity that you can share with others. So the phrase we're using is, you can share this without shame, without cost, and without delay.
Well, we've been really enjoying promoting 321, and listeners to this podcast can get into it instantly by going to 321course.com/JB. That's 321course.com/JB. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, Justin. Keep up the good work.
Hello and welcome back to the UnHerd Club. We are here in a fully sold out room and we are about to discuss the question of a Christian revival. Is it fantasy or could it be a reality? This is a topic that I think a few years ago would have been an odd motion for a debate of this kind. Certainly when I first joined UnHerd, which was almost exactly 5 years ago, questions of faith were still considered quite outré, either a little bit embarrassing or sort of dangerous. There was still, I feel like, quite an allergy towards taking them seriously. We did our best, and I feel the atmosphere now is very different. So this is my sort of opening subjective experience, that over those 5 years, there's been two things. First of all, the sort of political, cultural conversation there is a more Christian component to it, or the Christian thread in it is more visible, more demonstrable. When even Richard Dawkins calls himself a cultural Christian, you feel like this, and I suppose the question of Islam, which we managed to get stuck on upstairs in the preparatory room, which is why we were a bit late, is there in kind of stark opposition to that. And then the intellectual or opinion former Christians just keep coming. I've written a couple down here. Matthew Crawford, a philosopher that we've been publishing for years, had his conversion recently and spoke about it on this exact sofa, as did Paul Kingsnorth, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Nick Cave, and then most recently Russell Brand. He didn't do that on the sofa, he was in the River Thames. But something is happening at that level as well. So we don't have statistics necessarily, or we might get some from Justin, as to whether it's a broader phenomenon. It feels like we should try to get to the bottom of, is this happening, is it real, and where might it lead? I cannot think of a better group of people to talk this through with. In fact, their combined podcasts and YouTube shows are, I suppose, themselves evidence of a surging interest in questions of, well, certainly Christian faith in the case of Liz and Justin, and philosophical and spiritual questions in the case of Alex. So let me just introduce them. Liz Oldfield, sitting right here, is the host of the Sacred podcast. You're an early influencer. It's been going for some years and is highly popular. And her new book, Fully Alive, is just out this month, which is an incredible personal story of her own journey in and out of faith over the years, which I would highly recommend. Justin Brierley, also host of his own podcast and author of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, which is also becoming a documentary series. Is that right?
That's right. It's a podcast documentary series as well.
So it would be hard to find something more relevant to this discussion than that. And Alex O'Connor bringing a different perspective to the table. He is formerly the Cosmic Skeptic podcast and YouTube show, which is now having a rebranding and is called...
It's called Within Reason, although the channel, I like to go by my Christian name now, Alex O'Connor.
Right, there we
Christian
go.
name, notice.
Alex O'Connor, ladies and gentlemen. So join me in welcoming our group, please. Justin, can I start with you? Because the title of your book is so relevant.
Thank you.
What evidence is there for this surprising rebirth?
I think that there's been a real shifting of the atmosphere in recent years, and the image I use, if you don't mind me being really gauche and actually showing the title of the book, it's a wave on the front, and there's this famous poem by Matthew Arnold, Dover Beach, which has this well-known stanza about the melancholy long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith, which he wrote about 150 years ago, and arguably that's only increased as secularism and technology, science has sort of taken the place effectively in many people's minds of religion and faith. But yeah, I just became convinced after hosting lots of debates between Christians and atheists over the years that actually something had shifted in about the last 3 or 4 years. And I just wondered whether Matthew Arnold's Sea of Faith might be ready to come back in again, because as as Douglas Murray told me when I had him on for a conversation, he said the thing about the sea of faith is it doesn't just go out, it could come back in again. That's the point of tides. And so I was just noticing more and more people, like Douglas Murray and others, saying more and more sympathetic things about Christianity. I was noticing people that you've already mentioned, people like Paul Kingsnorth, having these quite surprising adult conversions to Christianity. And although these are all anecdotal, I did feel that something had changed in the atmosphere. Certainly the new atheism had waned in its influence and popularity.
Are there any stats, if we're going to have a kind of reason?
This is the thing, and the only stats I quote in the book are the ones that are contrary to my thesis. Yes, there are actually, we know well that the decline in church-going, the decline in religiosity, the rise of the so-called nuns, people who don't claim any religious affiliation. So that's all out there. We can all see the statistics about church-going in the West. And what I present in the book, at least, is essentially just a sense that actually that might not be the full story, that actually there's a sense in which there's a turning of the tide. Now, that doesn't mean that we're seeing a wave coming back at us, but I feel like something has changed and we might just be at the furthest end of that secularism before it comes back in. Now, having said that, since publishing the book last year, I have been increasingly bumping into what could turn out to be more than just anecdote. There are, I feel, some definite trends that are being noticed, polls, surveys, and so on. So, for instance, there's been several surveys now, especially among young people, Gen Z and so on, that just show that they're far more open than an older generation to spirituality in general. Now, that doesn't mean they're necessarily coming back to church, but it does show that they are not dismissing the God question nearly as much as an older generation have up to this point. So that's interesting. Just some really interesting specific, it might be just anomalies at this point, but there was some fascinating research from Finland showing that the number of young men attending church has more than doubled. I think it was something like between 2016 and 2020. And again, the same was true of their sort of belief in God and religiosity and so on. Okay. And more of these sort of bits and pieces starting to perhaps plot a little picture that what I noticed happening anecdotally might be starting to be reflected in some of the actual
Right. So, I mean,
data.
the big one is the census, isn't it? If we're going to be really kind of hardcore about it, that is the regular survey of the whole UK population. The last census was just dismal reading, for particularly the Church of England. I think it was literally under 1% for the youngest cohort. I mean, it really felt like it's vanishing entirely. Liz, you're also living in this world of talking to people, I suppose, in the avant-garde of the conversation. Do you share Justin's diagnosis?
To an extent, I would say there is a definite shifting in the spiritual landscape. When I worked on religion programming for the BBC, and then I ran a religion think tank, and the analysis about where we were a decade ago, I think, was true and is no longer true. The social permission to talk about metaphysical yearnings, to explore spirituality, to be actively looking for sources of meaning and belonging, ways to steady ourselves in a turbulent world, has changed radically. You are much less likely now to get sneered at, to get shouted down, even if you say you go to church. I think interest in spirituality, driven by, frankly, climate anxiety, by the breaking down of our generational trust, the covenant of life paths, the way economics has changed, the way it's hard to root. There's all these multiplicity of factors that are leaving, I think, more people than 10 years ago thinking, okay, how do I live? What does this look like? What does wisdom look like? It may not be that I can do the, get a nice job, find a partner, buy a house, climb the thing. Normally the midlife crisis kicks in once you've done those things for previous generations. It's kicking in much earlier now because they're not accessible to them. There's the rise in psychedelics, absolutely enormous, I think, for changing the spiritual landscape and really changing how people think about what might be here. What is the world? What is it's really, for a lot of people that come to our little communities, just they're losing faith in materialism. They're losing faith in a kind of naturalistic narrating of what the world is. So huge, yes, spiritual openness.
There's a kind of cultural existential crisis.
Yeah, huge metaphysical midlife crisis, at all ages. And I think we do see that Gen Z are much more likely to say that religion has got stuff to teach us about ethics. Like, I think there is an openness. The bit that I don't think has yet joined the dots is I don't think the church knows what on earth to do with those people, is quite hunkered down and high anxiety itself, in a lot of institutional crisis. A lot of Christians are not able to meet those questions with curiosity and openness and listening because of this kind of destabilized state that a lot of them in themselves. And I think there is this huge values gap over sexuality, absolutely enormous. And we see that driving a lot of the institutional pain and conflict at the moment. And for most of the people that are coming to this sense of, okay, maybe what I'm looking for is less of an individualized spiritual path and more of the like whisper it, old school religion, jumping that gap, becoming part of an institution that might hold a radically different view on sexuality from yourself is a really big question mark.
So, Alex O'Connor, the suggestion is almost that the market should be there for a Christian revival, but it's possible that the punters who might otherwise be going to church are going to places like your YouTube channel. I mean, you have nearly 1 million followers. We've just been together at a sort of talking festival, basically in Dissident Dialogues in New York, and Alex spent most of the day just talking. It was quite remarkable to see, walking around the crowd, and at every stage he had about 10 to 15 young men, mainly, who were gathered around him, waiting for you to carry on talking. It was like one of those etchings of kind of Socrates walking around the agora.
Sounds a bit like Jesus, actually.
Well.
You know, followed by a group of young men.
So are you an atheist, capitalising on a kind of misplaced Christian yearning?
I'm an atheist, but so are most of the people that we're talking about. This is the thing. Of course, it's not really cool to be an atheist anymore. When new atheism springs up, which is essentially a publishing phenomenon, by the way, nothing more. There's sort of, what is it that's new about new atheism? Well, it's disbelief in God with all of the political stuff. It sort of is indebted to 9/11 for its existence, for example. It probably wouldn't spring up without that. And a lot of people, the biggest thing that I think people get wrong about this is they talk about it as if it's some kind of new phenomenon, this meaning crisis. Like the panel that you moderated, the discussion I had with John Vervaeke was finding meaning in a secular age, which is quite a strange thing to say, as if this struggle to find meaning, this chasm of meaning is something new. It's as if it weren't the case that Scripture itself is littered with examples of people desperately yearning for God, and perhaps the most concise and original formulation of nihilism that can be found in written text is in Ecclesiastes. This isn't a new thing. Like, what's actually new here? Well, okay, Richard Dawkins publishes The God Delusion in 2006, and since then people are getting more depressed. Young people are finding it difficult to foster meaningful conversations with each other and have communion with each other, and they're staying indoors and isolated. They're not getting together because they're not going to church. Maybe what also happened in 2007, the invention of the iPhone. We have all these conversations about finding meaning in a secular age. What about finding meaning in the technological age? No, that would be a weird event to put on, but I think we're probably far more depressed and nihilistic because of that, because of social media addiction, because of being confronted daily by thousands of people with completely conflicting worldviews that make you think, well, of course I can't be right about this. And you can go to church now, but when you go to church, you realize that when you come home, you're going to listen to people halfway across the world who've just been to their equivalent of church and been taught something totally different. Being confronted with that on a daily basis probably has something to do with our inability to believe in God. So we talk about figures like Douglas Murray, like Tom Holland, like Jordan Peterson. These are people that you talk about in your book, Justin. None of these people will explicitly say that they believe in God, you know? And those that do, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, have said explicitly that the reason they do so is because you were there as well at the event where Ayaan just spoke to Richard Dawkins, and she gave a very moving account. It was almost comical the way that she sort of talks about her incredible story of depression and suicidality and manages to crawl out of it by praying. And then Richard Dawkins has to go, yes, but do you believe in the virgin birth? Like, you know, that's the important thing. Like, that was
tough to
pretty
respond
strange.
to.
But Ayaan said, I choose to believe it. She said, I'm so moved by the personal aspect that I just choose to believe that what they're saying is true. A lot of people tell me, that I have a God-shaped hole, it seems to me that maybe Ayan has a hole-shaped God, right? Like, it's no surprise to me that this is what's happening. Of course, people are going to be sort of like depressed and nihilistic for a while after something like the technological revolution. Maybe also New Atheism is partly responsible for that. I mean, for a while it's kind of cool, you know? Oh, there's no meaning, it's all just molecules and motions. Like, do you perceive your mother with that worldview?
Do you observe, though, the same thing that these guys have been talking about? That, I mean, rather than, okay, we can have a discussion about New Atheism, but what about the past few years? You said it's no longer cool to be so atheist, and I noticed when we did our panel at that same conversation, you quoted from C.S. Lewis' Surprised by Joy, which surprised your atheist fan base that were out there in the audience to see you. You know, regardless of the kind of deep truths of it, do you observe at least as a kind of cultural phenomenon that religion is in?
Religion is, I think, like Liz says, is just less condemnable than it was 10 years ago, because we were in the midst of, as I say, a publishing phenomenon where people were sort of talking about it casually in the pub. If you turn on like Fox News, people were debating evolution in schools. Now they're talking about school bathrooms, right? Like it's very commonplace to go into a pub. We could walk down to the Westminster Arms around the corner, and you probably find people talking about woke culture, gender ideology, this kind of stuff. People are just talking about it at the pub in a way that they're not talking about religion anymore. And that means that the only people who are left to talk about religion are people who are reflecting on it properly. It's not just part of the sort of cultural zeitgeist. So who's left to talk about it? People who've put enough thought into it to recognize that it's too simplistic to just say, oh, that's stupid, you know, you must be an idiot to believe in that stuff. It doesn't necessarily mean that people have sort of shifted their opinion. If you went into the Westminster Arms and said, I know no one's talking about this, but what do you all think about Christianity? They'd probably say, oh, you know, I don't believe in any of that kind of stuff. I think the same thing would probably be the case. It's just that less people are talking about it now.
I disagree. I think there has been a genuine shift in general openness to supernatural claims in that sense. So I think it is easier to talk without embarrassment about religion. I think it was much harder in the heyday of New Atheists because it was just, you know, the cool kids were the Sam Harrises and the Dawkins and so on. And I just feel like, yeah, partly because of the influence of some of those people you've mentioned, Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland and others, who have just sort of said, A, New Atheists really overreached, and B, it turns out we all basically need religion at some level. We're all kind of intrinsically religious. And C, it turns out, despite everything the New Atheists said, Christianity's done an awful lot of good for us, and they've just kind of helped to remind people of sort of some of the fundamental things that Christianity gave the West. And I just think that has actually had quite a significant impact, because these are people with very large platforms. And I think you do get a trickle down, even into the pub, of people saying, oh, you know, I just listened to Joe Rogan say it's about time we had Jesus back, or whatever. Now, it's not necessarily high-level intellectual thesis, but it's just a change in the way people are willing to talk about things. And even Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I think, her saying, I just choose to believe it now. I don't think that's her surrendering her intellectual faculties. I think it's her saying, I've discovered something that is it does not compete with my intellectual, faculties, but it comes in alongside it, and I realise that it doesn't have to be this either or any longer.
Thanks to Gareth, who wrote in to say, whether you're a person of faith, agnostic, atheist, or none of the above, this series is both genuinely thought-provoking and inspiring. I could not recommend it highly enough. Leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts or simply posting about us on your social media helps others to discover the show. If you want to follow more of my work, why not get my fortnightly newsletter? I'll even send you the first chapter of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God book for free when you subscribe. And if you'd like to support the show, you can get early access episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters will receive signed copies of both my books. For the newsletter and to support, visit justinbrierley.com or the links with today's show.
I mean, in Ayaan's case, what's interesting is that her first essay that she wrote here, UnHerd, sounded more political. It was a kind of sense that the West, as a collective society, is without moral foundations, and if we're going to find a way to rejuvenate, we need to rediscover Christianity. And then her subsequent accounts of it, which she started talking to me, and then I thought particularly a few weeks ago, were much more personal. where she talked about having had a really, really terrible period and how it helped her get out of it. So she is the kind of fusion of the political Christian and the faithful spiritual Christian. Can we really separate those two things, do you think? This question of more political Christianity or a sort of pragmatic decision to resurrect Christianity because we seem to be screwed without it, versus actually engendering kind of authentic spiritual revival in individuals.
I wouldn't see it in such binary terms as that. I think what we're seeing is the falling away of the myth that we make decisions based on arguments at all, really. I think there's very good evidence that we come to our conclusions about things based on the relationships that we're in and the people that we trust and the stories that make sense to us. The idea that Christians or atheists or anyone in between is going, right, where's the logic here? Let me just plot this on a spreadsheet. Okay, that's the path that I'm gonna use to lead my life. It's just bullshit. And Christians, I think, bought that lie for a while and decided if we can just meet these arguments, if we can just come up with a cosmology, if we can just make this neat and tidy and palatable for this very thin, narrow definition of reason, then we'll be able to persuade people. There are possibly some people whose formation means they think in maths, essentially, who might need that. Most of us don't. People who have had a broad attention to the world, who are, I think, trying to live wisely and deeply, know that our decisions are made, and these deepest decisions about who to love, these things that define our lives, the things that we say at our funerals are existential and emotional and embodied and relational. And so the sort of new atheist moment, and I include some Christians in that, has ebbed, and what you're left with is the truer thing. That we as humans, actually, most of us long for unconditional love, and we long to be seen, and we long to be known, and we long for a deep intimacy, and we long for our lives to mean something, and we long to be part of a story bigger than ourselves. And that's hard to find on your own. And even if you are going because you're like, okay, it's not working politically, even if you're going because you're like, okay, we can't base morality without this, even if you're going because you've decided that the anti-Muslim rhetoric, which I find very troubling, is right, eventually, if it's going to be anything real to you, you have to drop down to that level. And you see UnHerd Ali doing that in a way that I think is so courageous and so humanizing and so vulnerable. And I am grateful for it.
So, Alex, what Liz is almost talking about is a retreat of rationality, in effect. As a single organising principle, it does feel. You were talking about the post 9/11 period. There was the politics was also very kind of rational. There was this sense of this.
Can I just say a proper and needed broadening of the definition of rationality is what I would say.
Yeah, along with some of the groaners, I think that might have been an unfair characterization of what was just said. I think I basically agree in that there is an inappropriateness in bringing questions of essentially empiricism and maths into questions of meaning and narrative. It's as inappropriate as me walking into a science lab where somebody's trying to figure out how many molecules are in this glass in front of me and me saying, I can help you with that, here's a nice poem. It would be ridiculous and ludicrous. And I think it's just as silly when somebody like UnHerd Ali is telling the story of her life and about her relationship with God. And in Christianity, belief in God is not so much belief in an entity as relationship with a person, right? That's what it's supposed to be about. And I think it's just as inappropriate to walk into there and say, well, I can help you with that, here's some science. And that's where you end up with a Richard Dawkins and a sort of an inability to get anywhere in conversation. I mean, you were there, I don't know if you'll agree with this, and I'm sure it will be available soon, there are clips online. It was a wonderful conversation, but the thing that was wonderful about it was to see these two, not just two opinions, but two ways of approaching the world just come together and clash. And you basically get to decide not necessarily who you think is right, but whose approach you prefer. And I do think I agree, the one thing I definitely agree with is that this non-propositional, this narrative, this almost poetic approach to these questions is beginning to win out. That's what's definitely changing. The problem is that doesn't give you the belief in God, always. I mean, for someone like Ayan, she's able to just sort of choose to believe it. And to be clear, I'm very happy for her. I'm envious of her. I wish I could do that for myself. I find myself unable. But one thing that's been not
You
mentioned.
wish you could do what? Sorry.
To just choose to believe this stuff. I think it'd be wonderful.
So you would choose to be a Christian?
Yeah, I think anybody who, at least the kind of Christianity that I understand, or the Christianity that I've sort of read through the person of Jesus, for example, I think anybody who says that they don't want it to be true, that they wouldn't worship that God even if he existed, that new atheist line, just doesn't know what they're talking about, or is talking about a different kind of Christianity or a different kind of God. An important thing, though, that I think hasn't been mentioned yet is that this is, well, I suppose you were just kind of mentioning it there, is the political dimension here. So much of this, like you say, Ayan's original article for UnHerd was a political essay. It was lambasting woke culture, Islamism, a few other things, like China, Russia, this kind of stuff. It was a political essay. And I do think that a lot of this revival, if there is such a thing, is actually a political revival, a sort of protest against secular liberalism that people are beginning to see as failing. I mean, Ayan said to Richard Dawkins, atheism doesn't give you anything. This is the problem. It doesn't give you anything to live on. And Dawkins says, well, we have rational secular humanism, as if putting rational before what you find, aesthetically most pleasing. It turns it into an ethical theory. Ayan says, look, it's not working, Richard. It's obviously this isn't working for people. And Dawkins says, oh, we've just got to try harder, which I think is incredibly naive. I don't think it's doing the trick. So
but
in
what
response
else could
to
he say at that point? Yeah.
Without sort of having to say that he might be wrong about that, I suppose not much. but I do think he's wrong, is what I mean to say. I think he's wrong about that. I don't think that secular humanism is going to get you very far. That's why you have this weird, you said secularism earlier, Justin, and it's like people often conflate secularism and atheism, but it's funny how, while atheism might not decline, I think secularism might. You might end up with a bunch of atheists who still want to live under a sort of Christian society, which is a quite strange phenomenon. But that means that this is tied up with a political revival of ideas against people who are people are getting a bit fed up with what they perceive as a liberal elite. They're getting annoyed about that. They're upset about mass immigration, and so they start sort of trying to find an ideology which is going to be able to protest that. So you mentioned Douglas Murray, for example, and how he sort of likes Christianity and sort of is Christian adjacent. And I have to ask, why do you think that's the case? Do you think it's because he sat in a room and prayed and felt something moving within him, or do you think it's because he's not very happy about the way the country's going? And if that's the case,
I don't think he does describe himself as a Christian, though.
no, he's not a Christian.
Unlike,
but the reason why he would say that he sort of likes Christianity, or the reason that he goes to church, might be more of a cultural thing. And if that's the case, then that means that the revival that I think Justin is hypothesizing, but a lot of people, if at least secretly, are actually wishing for, they're hoping it happens, might not be a sort of meek and mild Christianity. It might be the kind of strong-armed political Christianity that, historically speaking, we've been right to be highly suspicious of and been right to criticize.
I think we saw that with Ayan as well. She was much more forceful than maybe people might have expected. Liz?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots in there that I want to pick up on, and I'm enjoying this very much, thank you. I think that we need to be careful of this. And again, I think it is a sort of Enlightenment heritage that we've picked up, or maybe just bad thinking that there's some sort of binary here. You believe, you don't believe. You're Christian, you're not a Christian. You want to be a Christian because you're nervous about all the Muslims, or you want to be a Christian because you've had a genuine metaphysical sense of an encounter with divine love. It's really messy. Like, it is all in there. I did not have a strong belief in God. I had a very strong ecstatic experience. I was a Christian. Then I, for reasons of, for intellectual reasons, was like, oh, this doesn't make any sense. Became an atheist, tried, failed, and now back. And we see it all through the tradition. Like Pascal, who is famous for his wager, but is much more complicated than that, has this moment where he has this night of fire, and he's like, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the God of the philosophers. Joy and love and like full-blown, out on the floor, ecstatic experience. The kind that people now only talk about if they're taking ayahuasca. A few years later, he's writing his Ponces and going, I can't believe it. Do I believe it? I want to believe it. If only there was more evidence. But there is some evidence. I'm like, woe is me, I don't know. But I think if I go to church, that will help me be becoming the kind of person I want to be. And so for me, some days I believe it, and this belief word, complex, philosophically. But some days I know in my knower. And some days I don't, but I want to immerse myself in this formation and these rituals and these rhythms and these communities which are much more likely to help me love my neighbour, deal with my ego, be braver and kinder and freer than I would be otherwise. And so I just think that, like, Is it real? Is it real belief, or is it political? Humans are messy. It's not as clear as that.
Justin, do you observe that as well? It's this, maybe when I said rationality in retreat, that was a kind of glib way of putting it, but actually a kind of rational dogmatism in retreat, or a sense that there's only one way to get to things. People are maybe more aware of multiple paths.
I mean, my background is in what is technically called apologetics, which is the whole idea of rational intellectual defence of the Christian faith. And the issue is that sometimes we can be really down on reason and the Enlightenment and all the bad things it's brought us. When actually, I think actually at its best, you have the heart and the head come together, and there's no need to create a false dichotomy between reason and belief in the supernatural, because actually I think, for me, they're just intertwined. You can't necessarily separate them. So, as much as I talk about the kind of cultural impact of spirituality and faith coming back on the scene, I actually think it's happening in lots of areas. I think, interestingly, even in science, there's far more openness among the scientific community now to the idea of some kind of a logos behind life, behind sort of a mind behind matter, that was very much a heresy under the kind of materialist, scientistic kind of form of new atheism. But now, lots of people being willing to talk about purpose and agency and something beyond. So I feel like it's like the defences have come down a bit, just to say maybe the world is stranger than we allowed ourselves to believe, because the fact is the scientific materialism is itself a worldview. It is a form of faith, in my opinion, that is not supported by the evidence, if you like. It's an assumption about the way the world is, which has not been shared by the vast majority of people before and probably won't be in the future. And we live in this strange moment where it sort of became quite a dogma among the sort of a certain part of the scientific community. But I just think that, as Liz says, life is messier and more complex than that. We don't simply... It's only quite recently that we've begun to engage our rational faculties as only science can tell us what is true and what is false. And I think people are quickly working out that's not the way we actually understand anything in life. And even science itself doesn't... you can't put it under that microscope. The fact we can do science, as many, prize-winning physicists have said, is a bit of a miracle. There's something bigger going on. So I just think the whole thing is just coming back to a sense of equilibrium, almost. It's not that there's a big swing back to religion, necessarily. It's just a kind of a swing back to common sense, almost, that life is more interesting than just, scientific materialism.
As our kind of final perspective, what would each of you like to happen? What does the sort of good version of this look like? Because it's quite easy to get into these metaphysical conversations, but is it even plausible, do we think, that sort of the churches that are everywhere in our country will suddenly start being full again, and that we will reverse or go forward into being a kind of active Christian society in the way that some people think? Let's actually try to be sort of practical. What could happen, and what would you like to happen?
I think what's already happening in terms of this abandonment of the propositional in favour of the narrative is probably a good thing. I'm happy to see it. I like it. I don't know if this is going to lead to Christianity. Definitely leaves more room for Christianity, because Christianity works much better as a story than it does as a scientific hypothesis. And I don't mean that as an insult. It's obviously not supposed to be. There are no syllogisms in the Bible. There's no premise one, premise two. Pascal says in the Pensées that he will never forgive Descartes. He says, I can never forgive Descartes, because Descartes sort of introduces God in chapter 2 to establish his metaphysics, and then has no more need for him, just sort of gets rid of him and gets on with his business. This idea that God is some kind of analytical tool to prop up your worldview is inappropriate, and that's probably right. At least that's what Christianity is supposed to be. When we were in Brooklyn, I talked about this idea I had in my head. You'll have already heard this, Freddie, of somebody about to throw themselves off a bridge, feeling very down, very suicidal, about to throw themselves off a bridge, and somebody comes upon them and says, "Hey, what are you doing? Don't jump." And the man says, "I'm just so hopeless. I've lost all hope in life." And he says, "Well, don't you have friends? Don't you have family?" And the man says, "Yeah, no, I suppose I do." And he says, "Well, have you ever thought about God?" And he says, "Well, sometimes I think God might be listening." And he says, "Well, that's worth pursuing, And then he shares his own experience about trying to find faith and meaning. And then he tells him a poem that begins to move the man. And finally, the man is feeling a lot better about himself and thinks, "You know what? Okay, maybe maybe this is all worth it after all, and he goes to sort of climb back over, and then suddenly he remembers that the modal ontological argument fails because of modal fatalism, and throws himself off the bridge. Right? It's ludicrous. Nobody thinks like this. That's not the way that people actually approach things that are meaningful in their lives. And what we're talking about here is meaning. Is just that. And so, like I say, it's inappropriate to sort of mathematize that. What Justin said a moment ago, I think, can be summed up in saying that this materialism essentially has gone from being a methodological assumption of science to being an ontological assumption of a worldview. It's not just we're going to assume materialism and see what we can do, we're going to actually think that that's how the world is. And the mistake that makes, this is crucial to me, is thinking that scientific laws somehow explain the universe instead of just describing them. It would be as though we discovered a book of Shakespeare's sonnets and said, how did that get there? And we say, I don't know. And I start studying it, and I say, well, look, I've just discovered, it follows this rhythm, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I'm going to call that iambic pentameter, the law of iambic pentameter. How interesting. And I've also discovered this law that at the end of a sentence there's usually a little dot. That's the law of punctuation, and how after that there are two types of letters and the big letter comes next. All these laws that I'm discovering. And someone says, well, where did the book come from? And you say, well, I don't know, we haven't answered that yet, but look at how much progress we've made in uncovering the laws of literacy. Surely one day this will come to explain the origins of the literary laws themselves and the origin of the book. It's a category error, it's a total mistake. Those questions are not probably fit for scientific
That could almost come from a Christian trying to put science in its box. We've chosen a very forgiving atheist on this
an atheist who practically sounds like he believes in God at this point.
I've got to ask, do you feel like there is any chance if we get you back in 10 years' time, you'd have a different answer to that question?
God willing.
Okay, Justin,
so as we're all quoting Pascal, one of my favourite lines is, make good men wish that religion were true, and then show them that it is. And the point of that being, we start with the narrative, the imaginative. We speak to people's deepest longings and desires. That's where the action is. And then, once you maybe have shown people how they would like the world to be, then might come that logical bit of saying, well, as it turns out, there is this person, Jesus Christ, and there might be some good philosophical evidence for God. And the problem is we've so often put those back to front by kind of playing to the New Atheist playbook of saying, you have to show me all the evidence, and we've kind of walked into that trap and said, OK, we'll play it all on your terms. And I think what I'm glad to see in some of these conversations that are happening in the public sphere is people are saying, no, let's do that when it's important, but let's talk about the way we actually encounter reality, which is through story, meaning, and everything else, and not see that as some kind of subpar version of reality, because that is actually the reality we all experience. And so for me, my hope is that the church, in its fumbling way, will start to do that again and start to actually help people to see why they would want this story to be true. That will probably mean, exactly as Elizabeth says, help losing some of our anxiety and just kind of being that place that I think Jesus was a perfect example of kind of saying, anyone can come with your questions, with your doubts, with your scientific materialism or your New Age beliefs. And there's a kind of an open table to kind of just sit down and talk about these things. That feels a bit like a sort of pie in the sky sometimes when you look at the state of the church. It is very racked by division and problems. But at the same time, I had a text message this morning from a Baptist minister somewhere near Bristol who just said, Justin, I've read your book, and the funny thing is, something has changed in the last 6 months. I've just had a meeting with a number of my Baptist friends, and they're talking about people coming into church in ways they've never seen before. Someone who literally had a dream about John the Baptist, then saw a church named after John the Baptist, went in and is now baptised. And they said, I've never seen that in 35 years of being a Baptist minister. So I just wonder whether, as I say, it just feels like something has changed. And whether the church will probably do a terrible job at capitalising on it, but I believe in a God who uses really rubbish people and actually does some quite extraordinary things. So I'm full of optimism that perhaps, yes, the church is not dead and there might be a future for it.
Liz, I'm going to give the last word before we go to our break to you. I just wanted to throw one thing in, which is the Russell Brand phenomenon. You had him on your podcast pretty early. That was a sort of early sign that he was going to be a Christian. He came on The Sacred. What was that?
I was
2
on
years?
his podcast.
You went on each. Oh, sorry, you went on his podcast. I mean, it's just a surprising place for someone like that to end up to most observers, or maybe it shouldn't be. To what extent is it those kinds of things, the power of testimony, of sort of individual examples, the kind of story you're telling in your book, that is going to make the difference?
I think that's always what makes the difference. People want to know, does this help with the pain of being a person? You know, that actually testimony is the way the church has always held out this word of life, saying, not I'm better than you, not I'm pointing fingers at you, not I'm judging you. Come and see. Like the woman at the well, come and see this person who told me everything about my life and has offered me life. Like, if it's not liberating us and steadying us, and I think crucially in these times, helping us learn to love our neighbours as ourselves, rather than let ourselves be increasingly divided just when we're going to need each other most, then what good is it? Like, I believe it's true. I believe the Spirit comes and helps us with that. But the reason I think we are going to see a much stronger tip back to actual religion rather than just spirituality, you know, bracketing out the work of God in the world, which I don't want to, but for the sake of this argument, is that we're really going to need each other. Generative AI is about to upend our economy and our livelihoods and everything we knew how to do. The sea temperatures are terrifying. Like, we have got to find a way to live better and more justly and more wisely and more lovingly. We really do need each other, and these are the practices and the rituals and the stories and the communities which at their best can help us with that.
I'm actually going to start with Dan Rabin, who has been watching on Twitter, and he asks, which I suppose many people might ask, what about fostering a sense of civic morality that can be taught to children by emphasizing a principle of secularism in public life? So this question that, you know, we're all sort of discussing whether Christianity is going to save the day. Lots of people might just prefer a more effective secularism.
Secularism doesn't really have any content, though, does it? I mean, secularism is really a political concept rather than a moral one, and it tells you what you're not allowed to do, not what you should do. And so when people say things like rational, secular, humanism, I kind of think these might be almost meaningless terms. I mean, humanism is probably the most meaningful there. You sort of know what's being gotten at. But what does it mean to have a secular morality? Does it mean to have an atheist morality? Because if that's what you mean, then fine. What you mean is some kind of moral system without God, which, you know, people have tried. There are tons of philosophical systems that might provide that. But why the use of the word secularism? You know, secularism is a political thing. I don't think it really is suitable to the world of, like, moral ontology. I don't know. Maybe I'm just wrong.
I think
about
maybe a lot of people just use it to mean non-religious, and I took from that question simply, surely we can just instill some kind of civic values and so on without having to specifically ground it in Christianity or anything else. I mean, it's interesting, coming back yet again to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, that when she wrote that viral article for UnHerd, one of the people who responded was Steven Pinker, and he basically said the same thing. He said, oh, come on, Ayaan, you can just be a good, rational, secular humanist and have all these lovely values you're looking for. And I think he completely missed the point, which was there in the article, which is she doesn't believe you can do that because she has very much been converted by the Tom Holland thesis that anything that we hold as these civic, secular virtues and values come from Christianity ultimately. They didn't come out of the ether, they didn't come from science and reason and the Enlightenment. They came from a much more ancient source.
Which can't be true.
Well, this is where we may have at least some level of disagreement.
I need to say something atheist here, and even if this isn't quite atheist, this is the big sticking point that I have in these conversations. I'm always very, very friendly and open to the ideas that are being discussed until somebody likes to say that, you know, Western civilization characterized by freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, you know, characterized by capitalist economy, characterized and celebrated for its abolition of slavery and its modern social justice movements, the rights of women, the rights of homosexuals. And we're told that these come from an essentially Christian basis, as if these things do not run completely anathema, each one of them, to what's actually written in the Christian scripture. You can't be talking about what's written in the scripture. You can't say that Paul writes that he suffers not a woman to teach and also usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Or that he writes that it's disgraceful for a woman to speak in church and she should go home and ask her husband if she has a question, which Paul probably didn't actually write, but that's just another problem with Christianity, that ended up in the New Testament canon. But and then turn around and say, oh, but the social justice movement, the women's rights, this is all sort of essentially Christian in essence. No, this seems to run anathema to what Paul is saying. The Old Testament giving explicit, not just instructions, but permission as well on exactly how to own and buy slaves, sometimes implicitly at least, as sexual slaves, and then say that the abolitionist movement was essentially Christian in origin, as if Christianity was screaming out in its ethics for the abolition of slavery, and it just took people over 1,000 years to work that out, and during those 1,000 years referring explicitly to the Bible in order to justify slavery, and it just so happens to coincide with the Enlightenment that people realize that that's what God was sort of going after all along. I don't know, I think it's kind of, as I've said before, it's not just wrong, but also potentially offensive, at least, to the people who've established these kinds of moral improvements against the very kind of religious authoritarianism that we're now being told is responsible for those ideas in the first place.
Well, if we had Tom Holland here, he would definitely mount a rigorous defence of his. I'm going to leave it for a moment. You can let that stew if either of you want to defend the Tom Holland thesis. And let's get a question from the room. First of all, do put your hand up if anyone has a question from an atheist point of view. And if there aren't any, I can well understand that. Here we are. There's one over here. You're not an atheist?
Not an atheist.
Agnostic.
Is that the best we can come up with?
I feel like it's quite a self-selecting
Well, I think
audience.
it is. I mean, are you an atheist, sir? Okay, we've actually got an authentic atheist over there. Sorry, we're
This is why
upgrading.
let's do politics, Freddie.
We're upgrading. No, I just want to get one actual atheist question before, and then we'll come back to you, sir. We'll come back to you. Sorry.
I don't know how that went.
It's okay.
Yes.
I guess for Liz, there was a very moving kind of speech you made about almost a kind of the ritualistic response, felt like a kind of coping mechanism almost against the dire straits we're all in existentially. And it seems to me that that's not a solely Christian thing. You're saying it's not as well, it's sort of more spiritual. But in an overarching sense, to me, that seems like it's just escapism. As much as it's also a potentially useful tool to deal with our anxieties. I'm wondering if that's not the best thing that humanity should be going towards at this point. We should be looking at things square in the face and
Staring the abyss.
well, we should be
Down.
looking at the potential abyss and learning how to avoid it rather than praying and not making anything happen.
It's a good challenge.
No. I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. I think something can be true and helpful for us. And my commitment to Christianity is both based on a sense of experience of the love of God, and it feels to me, and I have looked other places, like the place most likely to help me become the kind of person the world needs, especially in this moment. You know, to go back to the question about civic morality, the underlying anthropology is very faulty. They're like, if we just take off all the restrictions, we'll just make good choices. Leave us alone. We know how to tell the truth. We know how to lay down our lives to our friends. We know how to resist the impulses in us which are always craving more comfort, more convenience, more consumer crap, which is what's got us into this mess. We need collective formation. We need to immerse ourselves in communities of moral formation that call us to be better than we are. And I think it's no accident that if that pathway is also moving us to love beyond us that will meet us on this path, that it doesn't have to be true or useful. It can be true and useful. It can be true and helpful. But I don't see Christianity as a crutch. I don't see this as a distraction from the woes of the world at its best. And I really need to say it is not always at its best. There is lots that's indefensible, including a lot of Christians, including me. Like, living this stuff is hard, and we are hypocrites to our bones. But that makes sense within my anthropology. That makes sense within my understanding of sin, which is a very controversial word that I'm trying to rehabilitate. I think if we have any hope of rising to the challenges of this moment, we have to learn how to be becoming more together. And little individual pathways that secularism says, go, self-actualize, there's good stuff there, right? There's wisdom, there's great podcasts, there's great books. It's not that it's nothing to learn to meditate. It's not that it's nothing to do some psychedelics or do some therapy. These are all great things. I don't think they're enough. I don't think they give us the strength of formation that we need to resist the stories that are always shaping us towards our worst selves.
But it's still a pragmatic argument you're making, isn't it, ultimately? And this is what Richard Dawkins was posing to Ayaan Hirsi Ali a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
It's the stumbling block that a lot of people just can't get beyond, which is fine, even if it might make society better, it might make us as individuals more fulfilled and all the rest of it. If you have to believe a series of things which you know to be rationally not true, people don't want to do that.
So I don't think these are two separate things. I think in the practice of the rituals and the communities and the practices, those are modes of attention. They shape us. You have had Ian McGilchrist here all the time. There'll be lots of people here who know the work of Ian McGilchrist, who talks about the different modes of attention of our brain hemispheres. We live in a left hemispheric world. It has trained us to see certain things. The way you pay attention changes what you are able to see. Ritualized, communal, emotional, embodied forms of practice literally make it easier for you to see what is really there. I think God is really there. I think there is a logic of love in the universe that wants to meet us. But if you have to start with, I can't get on board with that, I don't know how to make sense of the metaphysics, but like Pascal, I'm just going to go to church and see what happens. Those things actually come together into a beautiful union.
Okay, let's get a question from the room. We'll come back to our agnostic over here, but I think it's okay we're okay to be Christian again. There's a lady over here.
I was going to come from an atheist perspective.
That's also good.
So, there's a very interesting debate on a podcast between Sam Harris and Bart Turtle, who's changed from being an evangelical Christian to being certainly agnostic, if not atheist. And he's asked by Sam Harris to define what the fundamental of Christianity is. And he says it's about believing in the resurrection, which seems to me as an atheist to be the most incredible piece of fiction that the whole of the Bible and Christianity is based on. And I wonder how the two Christians at the front will respond to that.
Can I maybe go to Justin for that?
Yes, I'm poised to go into apologetics mode, I'm afraid.
You're the man for it.
I would say, I would simply ask, have you ever looked into the evidence for the resurrection before dismissing it as a piece of fiction? Because there are many testimonies of people who've done precisely that and have come to very surprising conclusions. I could list just one very recent person. Molly Worthen is a professor of religion at the University of North Carolina. Funnily enough, the very same place where the person you mentioned, Bart Ehrman, is also a New Testament scholar. And she knows the good, the bad and the ugly of Christianity because she reports on it for outlets like The Atlantic and New York Times. And just a year and a half ago, she was baptised as a Christian. And it was because a pastor she was doing a sort of piece on for The Atlantic challenged her to go and look into the evidence for Jesus Christ, his life, death and resurrection. And when she did that, she found there was, to her great surprise, quite a bit of evidence that something really bizarre had happened in the first century. Now, I'm not saying that this will persuade everyone in the way that it evidently had an effect on Molly Worthen. But for her, what she said to me when I interviewed her about it was, I did have to confront my materialist sort of bias, basically. She said, I basically was just in a groove, as she called it, where I said, miracles don't happen. And she said, until I kind of questioned that assumption, obviously something like a resurrection is off limits. But the more she actually looked at the world around her, she realised that was a kind of just an assumption she had been given from childhood. It was a faith in itself, if you like, and that once she sort of allowed herself to kind of suspend that particular belief about reality, she suddenly realised there was actually quite a lot of good reasons to believe that someone called Jesus Christ may have lived, died and come back to life. So I would just say I don't think we're asking anyone to believe something impossible. We're asking them to simply
that Jesus died and came back to life.
That Jesus died and came back to life. I'm saying when you remove the materialist perspective that you've kind of been handed by your culture, suddenly things like miracles are no longer these kind of ridiculous flights of fancy. So I just think there's a sense in which I'm just asking people to take off the kind of particular worldview that they've been handed by their culture. And I don't think that is asking them to do something out of the ordinary. For me, it's about doing what Elizabeth has said, which is attending to the wider, full picture of what happens in reality rather than this very specific, all that exists is matter in motion and the laws of nature. Even as Alex has said, you can't get the laws of nature without having to kind of go one step up and saying, where did they come from? So there's a kind of an inbuilt faith, even for the atheist, I think, at that level.
Yes, but I would agree. I don't know if you would agree. I would assume probably that the point is correct, that the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus is the fundamental essence of Christianity. I think if it were so certain, I mean, I've looked at some of the evidence. I don't find it very moving, and there's an argument in itself as to why I wouldn't find it moving. But okay, like, yeah, sure, it's a better attested event. That is like the death and the visions after Jesus dies than almost any story from antiquity. That's not to say that it's well attested. And there's a great debate in the early church about whether the resurrection of Jesus is a physical or a spiritual thing. You know, like, there is an entire tradition of Christians who get excommunicated and condemned as heretics, and their texts get buried under the ground, famously a great deal of them in a desert in Egypt, until they're finally discovered in 1945. It's less than 100 years ago that we finally have access to read what these other Christians thought about who Jesus was and what he taught. Most famously, perhaps, the Gospel of Thomas. Some scholars think written earlier than the Gospel of John, or at least at the same time. At the latest, somewhere in like 200 AD or around there. This Gospel doesn't even contain a resurrection narrative. It doesn't even mention a crucifixion or anything like that. And yet this was one of the most sort of important Gnostic texts that ends up getting buried, as I say. And this isn't some kind of fringe Christian movement. I wish I could remember which church father it was that said of the early Christians, when you go into a new town, and don't ask to be taken to the Christian church, ask to be taken to the Catholic church, because otherwise you might end up in a Gnostic church who believe in a spiritual resurrection. The resurrection is here, it's now, it's inside of you, it's outside of you. This is the Gnostic teaching. This existed and was popular. It was popular enough that Valentinus, one of the great Gnostic heretics, or sort of anti-heretics, depending on how you look at it. You know, I love the Gnostic tradition. I think it's wonderful. As an atheist, I'm able to sort of read the Gospels, as so many people do, and say, well, I don't believe in all that stuff, but I think Jesus was a great moral teacher. He's a pretty good moral teacher in some of these Gnostic texts as well. Sometimes not so much, but then again in the New Testament canon also sometimes not so much. But these don't mention the resurrection, and some of them proactively say that it didn't happen, and I wonder why that would be such an active and live debate, to the extent that Valentinus nearly becomes the Bishop of Rome. He's nearly the Pope. And doesn't become so.
I mean,
but do you think it's time for a Gnostic revival?
Yeah, now that I can get behind.
You get on board with that?
That I can definitely.
That's basically transhumanism. We need to steer well clear of that.
Yes.
Just to very briefly respond.
In other words, I don't see why that would be such a live debate if the evidence was so clear, especially in the early
I think if you actually look at why Gnosticism arose, it's because they were buying into essentially a Platonic view, which was that the body is bad, physical stuff is bad,
yes,
and we need to get back to this spiritual, ethereal realm. And they didn't like the bodiliness of... Now, the point is, Gnostics all came a couple of centuries after the first Gospels, and they are very clearly talking about something very physical, something very Jewishly physical about the resurrection. So I appreciate there have been lots of divergent strands of Christianity over the years. The reason we eventually did say those were a heresy is because they just don't actually live up to the real earthy physicality of what Christianity has always been. It's always been about real life in the real world.
I don't think it's
not
always
a kind
been
of
about that.
Spiritual.
I'm going to take another question.
Anyway,
because we could spend the rest of our time on Gnosticism.
Well, I think it's important to know that there is a debate in the New Testament canon about the physicality of Jesus.
Point made. There's a guy over here.
Hi. I was interested in Alex's point about the revival coming maybe because of political and social occurrences at the moment. And for me, that seems to be one of the biggest challenges for Christianity, because you could say that most of the woke movement is based on this idea of valuing the victim. And where did that come? Christianity. And the other thing, like a big thing that's in the news, and whatever your views on it, there's a lot of immigration. And the Christian view of that, at least espoused by authorities in the churches, love the stranger. Now, if people are feeling like they're not keen on woke and they're not keen on mass immigration, what is going to be the Christian response to that? Because it seems entirely at odds at the moment.
Good question. Who wants to take that? So basically there's almost a political charge at the feet of Christianity that some of the slightly odder strains of our thinking at the moment, we had the W word there for the first time, woke, this evening.
Not the first time in this room, I imagine.
First time this evening. that actually is sort of a direct inheritance of the Christian way of thinking. It's sort of, there's a lot of...
It's sort of a snake biting its own tail, isn't it? Like, sort of, it's like, you know...
Ouroboros,
I'm happy to just accept on the premise that, sure, the original sort of concern for the victim grows out of Christianity, fine, but then what's the first thing that it starts doing? You know, homosexuals getting married, women priests, all of this kind of stuff, which, you know, a lot of people, I think the majority of people on the street probably would say that they celebrate, hard to know, but these are surely not Christian teachings. In other words, if there is any sort of Christian essence at the basis of this moral movement, it's a moral movement that's gone up to start sort of chopping off the branch that it's sitting on, surely.
Do either of Justin or Liz want to respond to the question?
Yeah, I think my answer to the headline question of this evening is there a Christian revival happening, is no, not yet. Then one might come. But how you define revival surely has to be not just bums on seats in churches, but some internal transformation. And I think Alex is completely right. There are many strands to this tradition. There are Christianities, right? We have squabbled and wrestled and discerned through the centuries about this very strange, complex, spiky, compelling, generative book. But I think you're right, there are some things that are reasonably clear, and welcoming the stranger is one of them. Walter Brueggemann talks about the quartet of the vulnerable. When the God in the Hebrew Bible gets angry, it's usually that someone has not protected the orphan, the widow, the alien, stranger, sojourner, immigrant, or the poor. And if we try and take on a Christian identity to shore up an unstable sense of self and to exclude the other, I think it's really hard to read the New Testament texts with any sense of integrity. The call to love your enemy as yourself, welcome the stranger, the sheep and the goats, feed the hungry, right? Visit the prisoner. That ethical strand, which is only one strand braided, you know, I would say it's the true strand, but so would everyone who disagrees with me, and that's okay. That, even if you pursue it because you're worried about immigration, if it's real in your life, the call to love the person with a different colour skin from you who has suffered and struggled across the sea to be here, that's where it becomes real or not.
But if you're just a Christian who wants lower immigration, that's got to be all right? I mean,
there's many political theologies that you can get from this thing, but whatever you think about immigration policy, if you are not welcoming the stranger, you have missed something. My guess is that almost everyone who spent any serious time with these texts would agree with you cannot get away from that. You might say we need strong borders in order to be able to welcome the strangers that are already here. You can outwork it politically in different ways, but hatred, fear, rejection of, disconnection from people because they do not share your identity or your skin colour or your language or your religion, I would say is just ruled out as part of this ethical path.
The question, Justin, though, was actually whether basically woke is Christianity's fault.
Oh, right, yes.
Is it?
Yeah, well, again, our friend Tom Holland would say effectively yes, it is.
But he'd say everything.
He says everything.
And that's okay,
would you agree with him on that?
I think in a sense, and in the way that Alex has just said, that yes, there's a sense in which lots of things that would come under that banner of woke today are a sort of an eventual outworking, if you like, of some of the core principles, which are about compassion, raising up the victim and everything else. I think there's a lot to be said that if you like, that might play into what we now call some of those quote-unquote woke ideologies. Where I want to be clear, like Elizabeth has just been, is that it's not good enough to just sort of co-opt Christianity for that agenda. Now, it may have important things to say to issues around immigration or gender identity or whatever it might be, but at core, the reason Christianity has anything to say at all is because it transformed the lives of individual people who went out and transformed the world. And for me, if Christianity is always kept as a useful political tool for potentially reinforcing whatever particular politics you want, it will fail. It will just
won't just fail. It will cause massive harm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Massive harm. And harm too, I think, the truth of the thing. And as Christians, resisting that is, in this moment, absolutely crucial.
So I do think there's lots of different directions this could go, and not all of them are, in my view, positive. It could be co-opted for a sort of Christian nationalism. And you do see elements of that in some of the things people are writing and saying. I see Ayan, bless her, as kind of somewhere kind of like teetering, and I just feel like just go with the transformation that Christianity brings and has brought to so many people.
The soft and cuddly version.
No, the hard version actually, because it's really hard to love your neighbour. It's not easy. Following the way of Jesus is really hard, and people have given up their lives for it. But it's the only way that brings life, in my opinion.
I'm going to do a question from the audience that are watching online. This is from Jules is a Guy. Could someone, probably Alex, differentiate materialism and physicalism? Okay, let's get technical here. He says physicalism is arguably more defensible and compatible with cultural Christianity. Just what does that question make you think?
I don't know. It kind of depends how the terms are defined. I really don't. I suppose I would probably use them synonymously, but maybe that's a mistake.
I'm married to a philosopher who would say it's a very live debate, but one that none of us are going to understand.
He asked a second very technical question. I'll throw this one at you as well. He said, can anyone, possibly Alex, delve into the ontology versus epistemology dichotomy and its relevance to this conversation?
Oh, yeah.
Does that one appeal?
Yeah, of course.
Go.
Yeah, no, these are terms. I think I used the word ontological earlier, and it's probably helpful to spell them out. I mean, epistemology is the study of knowledge. It's how you come to know a thing. Ontology is the nature of the thing itself. And they're useful terms, and they can often help clear up certain confusions. If you're discussing morality, for example, a lot of people say, well, morality can't be objective, because how could you possibly know, who's right and who's wrong? That's to make a mistake, because to say you don't... How would you know the truth is an epistemological question. It's about knowledge. How do you know what's true? The ontological question is what is actually true. So suppose it were the case that something were actually the case, something's actually true, morality is actually objective, there is a right thing to do. It's just that you could never hope to know what it is. You just have no access to that. It means you have no epistemological access to it, but ontologically it's still true. A good example might be, to steal an example from Sam Harris, how many people were bitten by mosquitoes in the past hour? Epistemologically, in terms of how we come to know that, it's an impossible question. There's literally no way, probably yes in principle, but like in practice, absolutely no way we could come to know that, but there is actually a right answer. So ontologically there is an answer, but epistemologically we could never hope to find it.
And its relevance to this conversation?
That a lot of the time people think they're discussing the ontology of God, but what they're actually doing is discussing epistemology, and they're discussing questions of how could you know that, what's your evidence, this kind of thing, and that's an epistemological question. But the nature of God, if God did exist, whether we can know it or not, what would he be like?
A classic example for me is Richard Dawkins. Whenever he gets onto the God question, he basically conceptualizes God as another physical thing made of many parts that has to basically be able to be looked at in a scientific way. And I think he's got his epistemology, in a sense, is being informed by his ontology of God. And he's just got the wrong ontology. He's got the wrong idea of God to start with, in that sense.
I think that's probably right. Who was it that said that Richard Dawkins has never in his career said a word about God? I can't remember who said that.
We have a question from the back.
Thanks not for coming.
Hopefully Jules is a guy who was happy with that very thorough answer,
Thank you.
I thought. Yes.
It's kind of following on from that. Because a lot of this has been way too esoteric and jargonistic for me, and I haven't been able to connect to it. So I kind of want to ask the Christians on the panel their experience of Christianity. Because for me, Christianity is not a conversation; it's an actual experience. And I was born, baptized, but was a really eager Christian until I was in my 20s, and maybe because I wanted to have sex, I gave it all up, and I became a real atheist and an evangelical atheist. And somebody said, when man stops believing in God, he doesn't believe in nothing, he'll believe in anything. And I took on environmentalism as my religion, and I followed and worshipped Greta Thunberg. That was my religion. And then the whole COVID stuff happened, and through all of those lies and the masking and the jabbing and the lockdowns and all of that anti-human stuff, I fell on my knees and I prayed to God and I said, stop this, help us, rescue us from these lies. And then I saw the whole climate thing as lies, and I began to see through it all. So I believe that every single person in this room has something common, and that is we all didn't exist one day.
We've got to have
and then we
get
existed.
A question at some point.
It's coming to the question, Freddie, I promise you. And we're going to die. So I think Christianity is an expression of dealing with that fear of death and how you get on with that every day. So what are the panelists who are Christians' experience of that really fearful, humbling, scary, messy experience of life that God gives you comfort from?
Okay, I think there was a question there.
Do I count as one of the Christians?
Well, you tell me.
People, from what you've been saying earlier, I don't know.
Well, I said I'm pleased that we got an authentic Christian question there as well. Justin,
I would
what
say,
would you say?
It's interesting the way you put it at the very end there. Christianity is basically about dealing with the fear of death and living a life that you can kind of... Because an atheist might be just as happy to give that definition to Christianity, and that's the problem, isn't it? That it's wish fulfillment. It's kind of, I wish this were true, therefore I'm going to believe it is true. I think, and the thing for me is that it's important for us to realise that actually a lot of the things we wish were true are true. There's a famous argument by C.S. Lewis where he said, think of a duckling, it wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. A child feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. People have sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. And he said, if I experience in myself desire which no other thing in this world can satisfy, the only answer is that I was made for another world. It's just the argument that if we do experience this universal sense of a search for meaning and transcendence, what if it's possible that we haven't just been led on a merry-go-round by evolution and a kind of blind, purposeless process, that actually there is something that meets it? So I think it's important to say there's that desire is not just wish fulfillment. It's related to something real. It's there, and it's at the centre of every person. I really do believe there is the God-shaped hole, and it's not just something we've psychologically projected. So that's my only response to that is I think that is it. You're right, that is what Christianity is, but the problem is it can play into a kind of a wish fulfillment thing. And I just want to say, actually, it's okay, because sometimes our wishes do get fulfilled, and I think they have been in the person of Jesus.
So your longing is almost part of the evidence in
I think
this
it is, yeah.
case. Liz, do you want to add to that, or should I take one final question?
You've heard enough from
Okay.
I feel like it's... Should we hear from our agnostic, who we sort of skipped over
I did
earlier?
promise the agnostic. You're quite right. Thank you, Alex. Sorry, my friend over there was going to have a question.
Sorry,
but no,
got everyone else, but that was...
you're right.
Yeah.
It was promised.
So this is also going to be the last question of this evening.
Oh, no.
So make it a good one.
Sorry, everyone.
No pressure.
Elizabeth, I think you're far too hard on yourself. That's the first thing I'd say. I think, you're really...
I'm really not. I'm really not.
It just, what bothers me about a lot of these discussions is very binary, this thing of being a Christian or being an atheist. And I really don't feel that. I've been meditating for about 40 years. I don't feel I have a God-shaped hole. I resent the fact that Christians say that to me, actually. It's quite inflammatory. I don't feel that as something I need to somehow fill with something. Maybe being brought up in Belfast has coloured my perception of religion somewhat. But even looking around, even an honest look in this neighbourhood, the church in this country has become part of the government. It's part of the establishment. We see it all the time. And I think unless the church disaggregates itself from power and from the government, it has no future, because it's just limited by politics. Where is the sense of cosmic wonder in the church? Where is the sense of the miracle of life? I don't see that. What I see is a bureaucracy, administration, and a maintenance of the status quo.
So do you feel like you call yourself an agnostic now? You feel you might have been a Christian if the church was a...
Maybe I was a little frivolous with the word agnostic. I don't feel. I feel I have a practice, a daily practice, and I feel that is that's enough. I don't feel this God-shaped hole. I don't feel the need to join an ideology, a religion, and believe in a word and promulgate it. And because a lot of that seems to me to be about separation, about dividing people. I mean, what I was brought up with was that this was used to divide people. And what we see in America now, where we're near a civil bloody war over these kind of issues, that's I don't see the church pushing back enough on the highest levels of the Catholic Church and Protestant. I don't see them pushing back enough on that.
So
I would just say
go on, Liz.
I agree with so much of what you've said, and the days when my faith is weak, it's mainly because of Christians or the church or myself. And yeah, the fact that we are so poor at living out this extraordinary call to love our neighbours and our enemies is a really serious challenge that we need to hear. And I'm really sorry if you felt patronised by Christians in the past or dismissed. That should not happen.
There was another question I feel in that, which is, what about the happy agnostics? And I'm going to throw this one at Alex, because those guys who were surrounding you asking for your questions, I don't know how many of them were Christians or not. You can tell us, but...
Well, interestingly, neither do I. That's the thing, because it sort of was irrelevant to a lot of what we were talking about, because everybody's sort of seeking the same thing. They're seeking meaning, they're seeking, broadly speaking, truth, at least truth of a kind. I think bringing up Ian McGilchrist was a wonderful thing to do. That I actually think that watching Richard Dawkins and UnHerd Ali was like watching the left brain and the right brain sort of battle it out, and you were like the corpus callosum in between. And there would be a funny joke in there about the fact that the corpus callosum actually does more to inhibit communication. If you weren't such a good moderator, it would have been a really good joke. Maybe I'll have to sort of say this for the next time.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely true that everyone's seeking truth of a kind, right? And truth of a kind is the kind of thing that a lot of people would dislike. But yeah,
do you feel in your audience that there are people who are basically fine? Who are, we talked about the devout Christians and then the people who are having the existential crisis who are imminently about to convert. What about what is possibly a majority of people who aren't especially concerned?
You never know. You never know what's in someone's heart, because if you'd have looked 3-4 years ago at UnHerd Ali, she might have been brought up as an example of someone who's like sort of, what about UnHerd Ali? She's got a successful career, she's doing well, she's got successful books, she seems to care about her work, and then 4 years later we hear this extraordinary story that she was considering suicide. Who'd have guessed it? And maybe she didn't even realise that herself. I mean, it's not like one day you start noticing you're depressed. It sort of creeps up on you, and then finally you're like, oh, this has happened, and you recognise it retrospectively. So are these people okay? I don't know. I'm not the person to ask that. But if there is such thing as a happy agnostic, then I'm certainly glad of it. And I think that if there's any rationality in agnosticism, that itself works as an argument against the existence of God, because if there were a God who wanted to come to know you, and you were openly seeking properly, this is known as the divine hidden, this argument, then so long as agnosticism is rational, I think atheism automatically becomes rational, because no God would allow you to disbelieve in him if you were truly open to his wisdom,
to
his relation, I should say.
Ladies and gentlemen, we always stop on time for these events, and so I'm going to do that this evening, although I'm sure we could go on for hours. Please join me in thanking Alex O'Connor, Justin Brierley, and Liz Oldfield.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation, recorded at the UnHerd Club in May. I certainly did. It was great fun to continue the conversations too, with audience members afterwards, sharing a meal as well with Freddie Sayers and the other guests afterwards. Thanks to UnHerd for permission to rebroadcast the event here on the Surprising Rebirth podcast. And there's a link to the video of the event as well with today's show notes. Now, I believe at the time that we're releasing today's podcast, it's not too late to get tickets to another upcoming conversation event I'll be participating in with Alex O'Connor. It's this Thursday, the 13th of June in the evening at Edinburgh University. We'll be debating again the thesis of my book and this podcast, that there's a surprising rebirth of belief in God. In fact, there was one moment in that UnHerd conversation where Alex put forward a whole lot of objections to Scripture being the foundation of Western morality, and I never got a chance to respond. Maybe that'll happen at our Edinburgh debate, we'll see. Anyway, check the show notes for the details if you'd like to be there. By the way, if you haven't read it, you can get signed copies of my book that this podcast is based on. Visit my website, justinbrierley.com. We ship them all over the world. But you'll get complimentary signed copies of both the books I've written if you become a gold supporter of this show and my work. It does make a huge difference to me being able to produce these resources and participate in these kinds of events too. I can only do it with your help. So if you'd like to get on board, again, do visit justinbrierley.com or click the link with today's show to support. Thank you again for listening. Do keep those reviews of the podcast coming through and sharing it on your socials and with whoever you think might be interested. It's so good to hear the way the show is impacting many, many people. Coming up next time, we'll be returning to our documentary format with the 6th act of our series, looking at mind, meaning, and the materialists.
Nature is awash in purposes. They're not generated from the top down by the great purpose giver, God. They emerge from the bottom up from a purposeless process. That's the genius of Darwin's idea.
Right. Well, I think that's a heroic project.
It is.
It is, but I don't think it's a possible one.
I was already booked to go to an AI conference in San Francisco. And then my wife ended up driving down to the little country church. We both had our experience. We compared notes. I reported from the field. Things are as bad as I expected and are clearly going to be getting worse. She said, it turns out this church thing is pretty good. And the next Sunday I went to church. We haven't missed a Sunday. And it just continued to pile on more and more.
Are we emerging from the meaning crisis? I'll be reflecting on the death of Daniel Dennett and the surprising rebirth story of tech pioneer Jordan Hall. But as ever, you don't need to wait. You'll get access to that next episode right now when you become a silver or gold supporter. Today's show was a production of Think Faith in partnership with Genexus and with support from the Jerusalem Trust. Editing assistance today from Peter Byram. You can find out more and how to support my efforts to bring thinking faith to the secular and Christian world at justinbrierley.com. The links again are with today's show. See you next time. Thanks for listening today, and to Ellis, who left this review saying, one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to. Historical, insightful, reasoned, and full of heart. So necessary in a culture that has forgotten why it is like it is. Just bought the book too. If you can leave a review, it helps others to discover the show. And if you want to buy the book, like Ellis did, you can get a signed copy from my website. As it happens, gold supporters of this show get signed editions of both my books anyway, plus lots of bonus content and early access. And of course, your support makes a huge difference to me being able to produce this podcast. So for the book or to support, visit justinbrierley.com or follow the links with the show notes.